I've been arguing that in the 20th century, Taiwan's most important comparative advantage was in speed-intensive production. Now, this idea of speed intensity, although this is my own label I like to use, it's not really my own concept. Okay, there's other people who've talked about things that are very similar. One thing you hear in business schools, people talk about short product cycles. An industry with a short product cycle, that's a speed-intensive industry. I want to look now a little more closely, though, and more systematically at what are the typical attributes of speed-intensive production. I've mentioned most of these along the way, at least in passing, but here I want to do it more organized fashion. Basically, when I say this is a speed-intensive industry, I'm saying four things. Okay? On the one hand, it's entrepreneurship intensive. On the other hand, it's variable factor intensive. Also, production costs are not as important in a speed-intensive industry. Finally, industry-wide local economies of scale. I remember talking about this in the hat industry. Okay, but this is also one of the main attributes of a speed-intensive industry. Okay, let me go through this one by one. First, entrepreneurship, being entrepreneurial intensive. Okay, what do I mean when I say this? Okay. The idea here is, if you're a business person and you're starting a business, there's two types of skills that could be important to your business. The first one is entrepreneurship. That's understanding the markets around you, okay? And it's the ability to understand these markets and to get the right good to the right market at the right time. On the other hand, maybe when you're buying things, also you can buy the right good from the right market at the right time. Okay, that might in some cases also be important. But entrepreneurship is understanding the marketplace and reacting to it quickly and well. Okay, that's something that's important. That's actually having to overcome external transaction costs. The most important transaction costs here we're talking about are information costs, and it's a matter of trying to get the information on the markets quickly and process that information, understand the information, and then react correctly to that information. That's what's important for speed-intensive production. The other important skill for production is organization. Are you a good organizer? Are you a good manager? Okay. Some production is organization intensive. This sort of production is production where maybe the market is not that hard to understand. Okay? You're producing cedar boards. Okay? And there's a market out there for cedar boards. They're pretty much standardized products. And you can check each morning online, and they'll tell you in each market how much the price of cedar boards are. Okay? Your main problem there is not understanding the market. That's pretty straightforward here. Your problem is, how am I going to produce cedar boards that are of the right quality at a price that's less than a cost that's less than that market price? Okay, that's the key thing for you. And for this person, he needs organization skills. He has to figure out how to organize his production, and often it might be large scale production. That's often cheaper, and getting all those people organized. It's also important to get the right equipment. And sometimes, if you're trying to cut the costs, you might need very expensive equipment. Equipment that's very specialized in doing certain things very cheaply. So this is kind of information costs. You need to understand and figure out what exactly you need and how you need to organize all this stuff. And then there's also some enforcement costs here. Once you get things organized, you gotta get people to actually do the work efficiently. Okay, so you need to find ways to you hire people. You need to find ways to enforce the rules and make sure they're really doing the work as efficiently as they possibly can. Okay. Now, of course, having better organization is always good. Okay, but for a speed-intensive industry, it's not really necessary. If your costs are a little high, and we'll talk about this in a second, as long as you're getting the right good to the right market at the right time, and you're beating other people to the market, if things are a little expensive, that's not such a big problem. Okay, if you can figure out how to be a good entrepreneur even though you're only so-so as an organization guy, you may still be a big success. But if you're into another type of production where the problem isn't, these fast-changing markets, you've got very slow-changing markets that are easy to understand, then the people that are going to become the most successful producers in this market are the organization guys. Okay? So, you sort yourself out. Okay? In Taiwan, there were some people that were very good at organization, and we'll talk about a couple of those. But most businessmen in Taiwan seem to be very good at entrepreneurship. That seemed like what they did best. One mark of speed-intensive production is that it often requires subcontracting. Subcontracting, if you want something done fast, you find somebody to do it for you, okay, so that you can scale up your production really quickly. But if you're in a market where it's not speed intensive, but you need good organization, you probably wouldn't use subcontracting, because then you're not controlling the production process. You're letting somebody else control the production process. And what you're best at is controlling the production process. So you can produce things cheaply, and you can produce them at high quality or good enough quality. So entrepreneurship is very key to a speed-intensive markets. Organization, manager, how good manager you are, that's more important for non-speed intensive markets. Second thing I want to point out here is talking about variable factors. Okay? If you're going to do speed intensive production, you need to use mainly variable factors because your production is always going to be changing, and so the factors you're using will always be changing unless your factors are very flexible, and these factors, probably the most flexible factor at this period is female labor. It seemed like the people owning the factories, they felt like labor was something that can be retrained to do lots of different things, and they found the young women in the factories to be the most flexible and to be able to give up one particular skill and learn another skill very quickly. Okay? So they concentrated mainly on using flexible female labor. Okay? And you might have a situation where some fixed capital good could do the job as good as a female laborer could. But the problem is, you buy that fixed capital good, then in a few months if the factory has to shut down because the markets have changed, you're stuck with this fixed capital. What are you going to do with it? Okay? For female labor, basically you just fire them. Okay? Or if you're going to have something else you can produce, you can retrain them. But this is the reason that so much of Taiwan's production was labor intensive. And a lot of people pointed out the fact during this period, and I don't know how good the statistics are, but many statistics seem to show that there was a pretty good measure of income equality in Taiwan during this period. And the reason is because labor wages were pretty high compared to how good the labor was, because people did want to use labor. They didn't want to invest too much in more specific machinery. If you did invest in machinery, you wanted to invest in machinery that was kind of multi-purpose, okay, that could be changed to do other things. Okay. There's one story I read about a Hong Kong producer of, I think what he did was he scaled fish. So he was producing fish for the market. He had a machine to scale fish. Okay. When that market changed, he no longer had a place there. He took the machinery and he figured out how to use that machinery to make wigs. That's a flexible piece of machinery. Okay, people are willing to use that sort of equipment. They don't want special machinery that's dedicated to one special purpose usually. Okay? So production is going to be always changing, okay? And it changes without warning. Okay? So the environment you want to do speed-intensive production is different than the type of environment you want to do non-speed-intensive production. Okay? If you're doing speed-intensive production, you don't really worry too much about a weak rule of law because you're mainly using these variable factors. You're mainly using labor. Okay, there's not much there that people can steal. You always worry that your factory is going to be held hostage. Some corrupt official is going to come along and want a bribe, and if you don't give him the bribe, he's going to shut down your factory. Or maybe the government turns against you, and the government starts trying to regulate your factory out of business. Maybe a competitor gets jealous and tries to burn down your factory. Okay? You want a strong rule of law so you know that your investment is going to be protected if you've got an expensive investment. Okay, that's kind of your hostage. Speed-intensive production, you don't really have much of a hostage. Okay? You can shut down production, fire your workers. The machinery that you're using is really cheap. You can walk away. You can start your business someplace else. You'll be okay. If you're doing something like a steel mill, you're doing something that is not speed intensive, it's something you need lots of organization, and you're trying really hard just to keep down the cost. To do that, you'll probably need a lot of expensive dedicated machines. You may need large scale operation. You're going to have a hostage. And so when you want to do something like heavy industry, you're not going to do it in an area with a weak rule of law. You're going to look for a strong rule of law. Now, Taiwanese firms, eventually, they're going to be going across the straits into China. One reason they could do this is because, at least early on, most of them were speed intensive, and they weren't leaving much of a hostage there. They knew they could walk away if things didn't work out. The important thing for speed intensive production is lack of regulation. You have to be able to close down quickly and fire everybody. Some countries you can't do that. If you want to set up a factory or set up a company, sometimes you need to do that almost immediately. Somebody comes out and says, "I can subcontract you, this, part of this project." Okay. Well, if you tell them, "Okay, tomorrow I'll set up a factory," you can take it. Okay. But if you're in a place where there's lots of regulation, maybe it takes you months to set up a legal factory. Maybe the neighbors will complain. Okay, there's not many places you can set up a factory. If you worry about it, once I set up this factory, it may be hard to close down right away. You're not going to be able to do that speed-intensive production. And so this is another reason that Taiwanese were fast to go across the strait. They knew that they could work with local governments there, and they could avoid regulation. As Taiwan's economy became more regulated, a lot of the speed-intensive production did go overseas. So variable factor intensive, that's important. Okay, you tend to work in areas with a weak rule of law and little regulation. You don't want a place that has a strong rule of law with lots of regulation. Of course, strong rule of law doesn't hurt you as long as the regulation is small, but it's not really necessary for you. Okay, the third thing I want to point out here is in speed-intensive production, production costs are not as important as in most other markets. Okay? Speed is more important than cost. Even if your stuff is a little expensive, if it gets to the market on time or if it gets to the market early before other people, okay, you can get kind of a monopoly price, okay, because you're a monopolist for a short period, okay, and you can make enough profit that you can make up for, you can get enough payment for people, you can make up for your higher costs and still come out with a profit. Okay, and if the quality is a little low, okay, of course that's not a good thing, but if you're the first person to market and you can get stuff to the market there when people want it, okay, they're willing to accept a little bit lower quality. Okay? In speed-intensive markets, the worst thing is a late good. Okay? If the good gets there late, it's often worthless. So people will tell you that, okay, just get it to me in time. Okay, if the quality is not quite what I want, okay, I can overlook that. Okay, if you're charging a little bit extra, I can overlook that, but I gotta get it in time. One of the things about this speed-intensive production, like in a quick changing, when fashions are changing very quickly, okay, a big part of the cost is after production cost. So this is one reason that production costs can be a little high, and you can still do well in speed-intensive production, because a big part of the speed-intensive production is things like retailing. Okay, you're also doing market research. That's important. Okay, you're doing advertising. Okay, these speed-intensive goods, you're trying to build up a market, and you're trying to get the right thing to the right place at the right time, and you're also trying to create markets through this advertising. That's a huge part of the cost of your of the product you're going to sell. Okay, Production costs, I think in clothing, production cost is probably only about half, okay, the cost of what the clothes actually sell for, because there's so many of these other after production costs to think about. So because production costs are less important, okay, they can be a little bit higher. Okay. For this reason, in Taiwan, as labor costs go up, eventually they came up far enough that the Taiwanese industry was maybe kind of pushed abroad, but it took a long time for that to happen, okay? Because the rising costs could be withstood. Even though you came to Taiwan and you found out that because maybe rising labor costs, the shoes now are costing 5% more than they used to cost you, you knew that these Taiwanese producers, they could get what you wanted on time. Okay? So you wouldn't take a risk going to some other place and that would do things, say, 20% cheaper, but who knows if you really get the product when you need it. You have to, if you're a speed-intensive producer, you got to kind of stay in the loop. You got to stay within the network. This is another reason that it's going to take you a long time before you're willing to finally go overseas. And this is going to lead to this, industry-wide economies of scale. Okay? But you have to stay in the network. Okay, that's the most important thing. You got to get the information fast. In the hat industry, it seems like the women's wages in the hat area really were higher than women's wages in most other places in Taiwan, but people didn't move out there to get those lower wages because that would have meant less information. They get the information slower. It just wasn't worth it. The last thing I want to talk about here, which I've already talked about the hat industry, so I'll do this kind of quickly. Okay, local scale economies, industry-wide local economies of scale. Okay, in speed-intensive industries, you need information quickly, and then also since the markets are always changing, your production facilities are not going to match kind of the contract you can get from the buyer. So you're going to also, for this reason, need subcontracting. Okay? And so you need to be near other producers. You're going to all group together. Another reason for this is that since the work is uncertain, you need to, a lot of times the market changes. You can't depend on having a job for years and years. Okay? It's not like being a government bureaucrat where you get in there and you're going to be there till you retire. Okay? Here, you never know. You get the job, and maybe in 6 months you're fired because the company is shut down or changes production to something that doesn't need you. Okay? So workers like to be in areas where there's a lot of these companies, and then when they get fired one place, they can move on to another place. Okay? So you want to have lots of potential employers. I see I misspelled employer. EMPLOYERS. Okay. Sorry about that. I've already talked about, in the United States, the garment district was an example of this. The idea before the war of producing your garments, especially your women's clothing, in upstate New York, or maybe out of state, someplace like Pennsylvania, that wasn't really thought of because people needed to get the information fast. Okay, everybody was kind of working in the garment district in Manhattan, New York. Okay? There was some production elsewhere, but that's where the production really centered for most of the top clothing companies. The idea that you might say, let's produce this clothing in Japan or Taiwan, people would think, you're insane. Okay, I mean, that's just way far out there. You'll never get the information out there. Even if the labor is free, it's just not worth it. Okay, so everybody concentrated in the garment district. Okay? Well, in the hats, everybody concentrated in the hat district in Taiwan. Okay? Later on, with electronics, people tend to like to concentrate around the Hsinchu. Okay, that's where we have the high-tech area here in Taiwan, though that's changing a little bit too. Hollywood is another example, which I already mentioned. Okay, if you've got a lot of different people who have to work together and you're always changing who you're working with, okay, it's better you all kind of live around the same place. Okay, and you coordinate things. So those are the main, characteristics of speed-intensive production. Why is it that the Taiwan business networks had these characteristics? And I've told you, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm still kind of researching this. Okay. One idea is that it's something to do with, at least the culture kind of the Southeast Chinese coast, the way business is done there. Some people have said maybe it's because of the family system, that people tend to work in small and medium enterprises, and then they just happen to evolve into speed-intensive production because that's what these small enterprises do best. I've kind of thought of the idea that maybe it's because these manufacturers often at the beginning they're merchants, and merchants that are buying and selling, and then they kind of backward integrate into producing their own products. And so maybe this is a type of kind of merchant manufacturing. This is kind of true in the hat industry. A lot of the people just were kind of buyers of hats that bought from women, and they really saw themselves more as hat merchants. They didn't describe themselves so much as hat manufacturers. So maybe merchants are just good at understanding the markets. They're very good at getting stuff to the right market at the right time, and so they're good at speed-intensive production. And Taiwan, among many other economies in Asia, they had a lot of merchants who could start doing manufacturing, and they did speed-intensive manufacturing. Where does the other type of manufacturing come from? More large-scale, organization-specific manufacturing. Well, in Taiwan, it's hard to see where these manufacturers would have learned how to organize and how to run these big machines. It could be that the Japanese were fulfilling that role in Taiwan, and so the Taiwanese had little opportunity to learn this sort of production. Big business, where does it come from? And big business often is more, organization intensive. They're big organizations. Alfred Chandler, an important business historian, he thought that basically what happens in the West is that the railroads were the first, big businesses. And then the big manufacturers learned the skills from the railroad. And the railroads were big business because that's the only way you could run a railroad. And then these skills, though, they started being used successfully by steel producers, by automobile producers. Okay. So that this was a skill, organization, and being a good manager that kind of evolved out of the railroads. Well, Taiwanese didn't run much. There was a railroad in Taiwan, but very few Taiwanese ran railroads. That was mainly ran by the Japanese, and there's really only one big railroad, going north-south. Okay, so not a lot of opportunity to learn there. Another idea is that maybe organization could be learned from the military. Okay? Now, you don't see a lot of examples of military people becoming big entrepreneurs, but it could be that a lot of the more middle management people could have some military experience. In the United States, the rise of big business occurs after the Civil War. In Japan, sometimes people like to talk about the importance of the samurai to Japanese business. They weren't really that important as CEOs, but they could have been important there as middle management. So, maybe through the military, you could learn organization. Again, Taiwan wasn't really into, any big wars. Okay, they didn't have the military to learn these skills. So maybe it's just a matter of Taiwan not having the opportunity to learn the organization skills, so they tended to specialize in what they did know. Okay, meeting market demand quickly. That was something that the merchants had already had long years of experience with. So that would be maybe one of my best hypothesis right now for why Taiwan starts out in this way.